My name is James Carter. I was 34 years old when the universe stopped making sense, and then, somehow, started making perfect sense again. I had been stationed aboard the UES Resolute, a deep space monitoring vessel assigned to Sector 7 Gamma, about 14 light-years from the edge of what humanity called the outer boundary. It was not a glamorous post. We were basically a floating antenna. 12 crew members, 1 ship, and an ocean of silence stretching in every direction. My job was simple: listen, log, report. Nothing ever happened out here. Nothing ever came from out here. Until the night everything changed. It was 0300 hours ship time. I was alone in the monitoring bay, drinking terrible coffee and staring at screens full of static when the first pulse hit. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a soft, rhythmic beeping that didn't match anything in our database. I almost ignored it. I almost wrote it off as interference from a nearby pulsar we'd been tracking for weeks. Almost. But something in my gut told me to lean forward. So I did. I pulled up the signal analyzer and ran it through 3 different filters. The result came back the same every time. This was not natural. This was not a pulsar. This was not background radiation or solar wind or any of the 1,000 boring things that usually filled our logs. This was structured. This was intentional. Someone, or something, had sent this signal, and they had aimed it directly at the one patch of space where they knew a human ship would be listening. I sat there for a full minute, not breathing. Then I hit the alert button. Within 4 minutes, Captain Diane Wells was standing behind me in her pajamas, her gray hair loose around her shoulders, squinting at my screen with the focused intensity of a woman who had spent 30 years in deep space and had never once panicked. That was one of the things I respected most about Captain Wells. She didn't panic. She processed. "Run it again," she said quietly. I ran it again. Same result. She leaned closer. "Is it a repeating loop?" "No, ma'am. It's evolving. Every cycle adds new data. It's like it's building a picture piece by piece." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she straightened up and crossed her arms. "Wake the linguistics team. Wake everybody." She paused at the doorway and looked back at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before. Something close to awe. "James," she said, "I think someone out there just asked us for help." She was right. It took our linguist, Dr. Yara Singh, 6 hours to crack the base structure of the signal. It was not in any language we had ever encountered, but it was built on mathematics, on prime numbers and geometric ratios that any intelligent species would recognize. Yara was brilliant. She had spent her entire career preparing for exactly this moment, and when she finally looked up from her console with tears streaming down her face, we all knew she had found something real. "It's a distress call," she whispered. "A full SOS. Coordinates, threat description, population count. They're telling us exactly how many of them are going to die." She swallowed hard. "And they're telling us how fast." The room went completely silent. "How many?" Captain Wells asked. Yara looked at her screen. 4,600,000,000. Nobody spoke for a very long time after that. I stared at the number on the screen. 4,600,000,000 lives. I thought about Earth. I thought about my mother in Cincinnati. I thought about my little sister who had just had her first baby 3 months ago. I tried to imagine someone sending a signal into the dark, begging for help, not even knowing if anyone was listening, not even knowing if anyone could help, just throwing their voice into the void because it was the only thing they had left to do. I understood that feeling. I think every human being, at some point in their life, understands that feeling. I turned to Captain Wells. "We're going to answer, aren't we?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, with absolute certainty. "We're going to do a lot more than answer," she said. The next 48 hours were the most intense of my life, and I had survived a reactor breach on my second tour that killed 2 people and left me with scars on my left arm that I still traced with my fingers when I was nervous. Yara didn't sleep. None of us did, really. We worked in shifts around her station, feeding her coffee and data and quiet encouragement while she peeled back layer after layer of the signal like someone unwrapping something fragile and irreplaceable. By the end of the first day, she had built a working translation matrix. By the end of the second, she had a full picture. The species that sent the signal called themselves the Velhari. That was the closest our vocal systems could get to their actual name, which involved a harmonic tone that human throats couldn't quite produce. They were roughly humanoid, bipedal, warm-blooded, with large amber eyes adapted to a homeworld that orbited a dim red star. Their civilization was old. Older than ours by at least 3,000 years. They had faster-than-light travel, advanced medicine, sophisticated art and culture and philosophy. They were, by any reasonable measure, A remarkable people. And they were being destroyed. The threat was a species they called the Kreth. The signal didn't give us much physical description. The Velhari seemed to assume that whoever received their message would already know what the Kreth were. That detail alone told us something terrifying. The Kreth were apparently well known enough in this part of the galaxy that a civilization sending a desperate SOS assumed the recipients had already heard of them. We hadn't. But we learned fast. From the data embedded in the signal, we pieced together the basics. The Kreth were a hive-minded warrior species. They didn't negotiate. They didn't occupy or colonize. They consumed. Every planet they encountered, every civilization they found, they stripped completely: resources, technology, biomass. Everything. They left nothing behind. No survivors, no ruins, no records. Just dead worlds drifting in empty orbits, as silent and barren as the day they formed. The Velhari had been fighting them for 11 years. They had started with a fleet of 400 warships. They were down to 63. Their homeworld had 3 weeks left. Captain Wells sent the full report to Earth Command within the hour. She flagged it Priority Omega, the highest classification in our system, reserved for existential-level events. She included every piece of data Yara had extracted, every translation, every coordinate. And then she added a personal note at the bottom. I read it over her shoulder as she typed it. It said, "Command, we have confirmed first contact with a sentient civilization in immediate danger of extinction at the hands of a hostile force." The Velhari did not ask for soldiers. They asked for anyone who was listening. I am recommending immediate mobilization. If we do not respond, we are not the species I believe we are. Captain Diane Wells, U.S. Resolute. She sent it before anyone could tell her not to. The response from Earth Command came back in 9 hours. 9 hours to cross 14 light years. Which meant someone had been waiting, watching, and the moment that signal arrived, they had moved fast. The response was 3 words long. Armada is forming. I read those 3 words and sat back in my chair and felt something shift inside my chest. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something bigger than hope. Something older. The feeling you get when you realize that the people around you are not going to run. The feeling you get when you understand, deep in your bones, that you are part of something that does not abandon the helpless. I pressed my hand flat against the cold metal wall of the monitoring bay and thought, Caro. From this moment. From right here. Everything changes. I was right about that. I had no idea how completely I was right. I had never seen Earth move fast before. That sounds like a strange thing to say about the planet that invented the combustion engine, split the atom, and reached the moon in under a decade when it felt like it had to. But in my experience, in the experience of most people who'd spent time in Space Command, Earth moved slowly. Committees had to meet. Budgets had to be approved. Generals had to argue with politicians and politicians had to argue with each other, and by the time anyone actually did anything, half the urgency had already leaked out of the situation. Not this time. Within 6 hours of Earth Command receiving Captain Wells's message, the Emergency Defense Council had been called into session. Within 12 hours they had voted unanimously to respond. Within 18 hours, the first mobilization orders were going out to every active fleet in human space. I know all this because they kept us informed. Every update, every development piped directly to the Resolute in real time. I think someone at Command understood that we needed to see it. That we needed to know what we had started. The human fleet, at full mobilization, was not something most civilians ever thought about. People knew we had ships. They knew we had weapons. But the full scope of what humanity had quietly built over the last century of space travel was not something that ever made the news back home. It wasn't secret exactly. It was just big. Big in a way that was hard to comprehend unless you saw it assembled in one place. Our chief engineer, a big quiet man named Marcus Webb, had served in the military before joining deep space exploration. He had seen the fleet once, during a full mobilization drill 15 years ago. When he read the order and understood what was happening, he sat down heavily in the nearest chair and let out a long, slow breath. How many ships? I asked him. He looked at me. When I saw it last, just the active combat fleet was over 2,000 vessels. That was 15 years ago. He shook his head. James, they've been building since then. They've always been building. Why? I asked. We've never had a real war in space. He looked at me with something patient and a little sad in his eyes. Because we come from a planet that tried to eat itself for 10,000 years, he said quietly. We never stopped building weapons. We just stopped pointing them at each other. I thought about that for a long time. The Resolute was assigned as a forward scout. Our knowledge of the signal, our translated data, our coordinates made us too valuable to pull back. We would lead the advance fleet to the Velhari system. We would make first contact. Captain Wells accepted the assignment without hesitation. I noticed she didn't ask the crew if they were willing. She didn't have to. Nobody asked to be transferred off. We pointed our nose toward the coordinates Yara had extracted from the signal and we started moving. Behind us, somewhere in the dark, an Armada was waking up. I stood at the observation window that night, really night this time, actual off hours, and stared into the black. The stars out here were different from the ones you saw from Earth. Colder. More distant. But there was one cluster off to the port side that was new, one I hadn't seen before at this angle, and it was beautiful in a sharp, clean way that made my chest ache. Somewhere out there, 4 billion people were counting the days they had left. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and made a promise I had no authority to make and no certainty of keeping. "We're coming," I said. HFY, from this point on, I don't look away. "We're coming for all of you." The stars didn't answer. They never do. But I meant it anyway. We reached the edge of Velhari space 11 days later. I expected something dramatic at the border, some kind of challenge, a demand for identification, maybe a weapons lock. What we got instead was silence followed by a single, careful transmission on the same frequency as the original SOS. It was not a greeting. It was not a warning. It was, as best as Yara could translate it, a question. "Are you real?" It broke something open in my chest when she read it aloud. The quiet desperation in those 3 words, the exhausted disbelief of a people who had been fighting alone for so long that the idea of rescue felt more like a hallucination than a possibility. Captain Wells took the calm herself. "Lieutenant Singh," she said, "tell them yes. Tell them we are very, very real. And tell them we brought friends." Yara composed the response carefully. It took her 20 minutes to build the right harmonic structure, the right mathematical framing. She sent it. We waited. The response came back in 40 seconds. I don't know exactly what it said, the translation was complex and layered, but Yara sat back in her chair and covered her mouth with both hands, and her shoulders were shaking. I put my hand on her arm. "What did they say?" I asked softly. She looked up at me with wet eyes and a smile that was the most exhausted, relieved, beautiful thing I had ever seen on a human face. "They said." She stopped, composed herself. "They said the word that means something like, 'We dared to hope but we did not believe. Now we believe.'" The whole room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus Webb, who never showed emotion, who had the face of a man carved from old wood, cleared his throat and looked very hard at a point on the ceiling. And I thought, yeah, me too. We were escorted to the Velhari command station by a small fleet of their remaining warships. Seeing them up close for the first time was something I will never forget. They were elegant vessels, long, curved, almost organic in their design, built with a kind of aesthetic care that you could see even in the functional elements. These were ships built by a people who believed beauty mattered even in war. The fact that they were battered, scarred with impact burns and patched with mismatched hull plating, made them more beautiful, not less. These ships had fought. These ships had endured. The commander who greeted us was named, as closely as I can render it, Ven. She was tall, thin, with that amber gaze I'd seen described in Yara's translations. Her face was angular and still, and she held herself with the upright dignity of someone who had been refusing to collapse for a very long time. She looked at Captain Wells across the small meeting room we'd assembled in, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ven said something. Yara translated. She says, "You are the ones they call Deathworlders." Captain Wells raised an eyebrow. "That's what they call us out here?" Yara nodded carefully. "It's not an insult. It's more like a classification. Earth is what's called a high-gravity, high-predator, high-threat homeworld. Most species that develop on planets like Earth don't survive long enough to develop civilization. The ones that do are." She glanced at her notes. "The word closest to it is forged. Shaped by danger into something unusually resilient." Captain Wells was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Ven and said, "Tell her that where we come from, when someone sends an SOS, we answer it. That's not resilience. That's just who we are." Ven listened to the translation. And for the first time, her composed, still face shifted into something that I could only describe as relief so deep it looked like grief. She said something short and quiet. She says, Yara translated softly, "Then you are more than we hoped." Ven gave us everything. Every piece of data her commanders had gathered over 11 years of fighting the Kreth. Fleet movements, attack patterns, weapons capabilities, tactical behaviors. She gave it all without hesitation, without the political hedging or strategic information holding I'd been half expecting. There was no time for games. She knew it. We knew it. The picture she painted was grim. The Kreth fleet numbered somewhere between 800 and 1,000 vessels. Their ships were not elegant. They were massive, dense, brutally functional, built like fists, designed entirely around the delivery of overwhelming force. They had no defensive specialists, no support vessels, nothing that didn't serve the singular purpose of breaking things. What they lacked in strategy they made up for in weight. They didn't maneuver. They didn't outthink. They just came at you until you broke, or they did, and in 11 years of warfare, it had always been the Velhari who broke first. Their weapons systems? Our tactical officer, Commander Ray Okafor, asked. He was leaning over the data table with the focused, hungry look he always got when he was processing military information. Ray had been a fleet tactician before he joined the Resolute. He'd never really stopped being one. Yara relayed the question. Ven answered. Energy-based, Yara translated. Sustained beam weapons, very high output. Effective at medium and close range. Long-range accuracy is poor, they prefer to close the distance fast and overwhelm. Their hulls are thick but not especially sophisticated. More armor than shielding. Ray nodded slowly. I could see him building something in his head. And their coordination? Are they responsive to flanking? Adaptive. Another exchange. Yara frowned as she translated. She says, the Kreth fight as a swarm. Individual ships don't make independent decisions. They respond to collective signals from what seems to be a command organism embedded in the main fleet body. If you target the swarm's edge, the whole formation responds. But, Yara paused, listening to a longer response from Ven. But she says they've never been able to find the command organism. Every time they thought they identified it, it moved. Or it wasn't there. She says it's possible the command structure is distributed, spread across multiple ships rather than centralized. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Captain Wells. That's actually a vulnerability, he said quietly. Explain, she said. A distributed command structure is harder to decapitate. You can't just kill one ship and collapse the whole swarm. But it also means the swarm's intelligence is its weakest point when it's stressed. A human brain can adapt to unexpected situations in milliseconds. A committee of 10 brains takes longer. A swarm of hundreds. He shook his head. You hit them with something they've never seen before, something that breaks their pattern, and there will be a lag. Maybe a short one. But in fleet combat, a lag is everything. Captain Wells looked at Ven. Tell her that help is 11 days behind us, she said. Tell her we need her fleet to hold for 11 more days. And tell her that when the Armada arrives we fight together. Human ships and Velhari ships, side by side. Nobody holds back. Nobody waits to see what happens. We commit everything at once. Ven listened to the translation. She looked at Captain Wells for a long, measuring moment. Then she said something that Yara translated very carefully. She says, the Velhari have fought alone for 11 years. We had almost stopped believing in the concept of together. She says. Yara's voice caught slightly. She says together feels like a word she is learning for the first time. Captain Wells reached across the table and placed her hand over Ven's. A gesture she clearly hadn't planned that just happened, the way human gestures sometimes do when words run out. Ven looked down at the hand on hers. Then she placed her other hand on top. I had to look away for a moment. Those 11 days were the hardest weight of my life. The Kreth were not idle. They probed the Velhari perimeter 3 times while we were there, and each time I watched the remaining 63 Velhari warships scramble to meet them, I felt something cold and tight in my chest. 63 ships against the leading edge of a swarm that had already destroyed hundreds. The Velhari pilots were extraordinary, better than I had any right to expect, given what they'd been through, but extraordinary wasn't enough against those numbers. They held each time. Barely. I spent most of those 11 days in the command station, working alongside Ray and Ven's tactical officers, building a battle plan. It was strange and wonderful work. Strange because we were doing it across a language barrier with beings from a completely different evolutionary tree, wonderful because mathematics and physics are the same everywhere, and the language of tactics translated better than almost anything else. We argued, through Yara, in the way that military planners always argue, sharp and focused and without ego, because ego in a battle plan costs lives. We had one major advantage over the Velhari's previous 11 years of warfare. We were something the Kreth had never encountered before. The Velhari had fought them with elegant, precise, energy-based tactics. The kind of warfare that made sense for a civilization built on intelligence and refinement. It was brilliant fighting. It just wasn't the kind of fighting that rattled the Kreth. because the Kreth had seen it before in various forms from the 8 civilizations they'd already consumed. They had never met a species that fought the way humans do. Ray explained it to me one night over the closest thing to coffee the Velhari could provide, which was a warm, slightly sweet liquid that tasted like tea had an argument with cinnamon. "We fight dirty," he said simply. "Not dirty like unfair, dirty like unpredictable. Humans don't have one fighting style. We have 10,000 of them and we pull from all of them at once. We use terrain. We use timing. We sacrifice pieces to set up plays 3 moves ahead. We feint. We deceive. We make the enemy think they understand what we're doing and then we do something completely different." He sipped his alien tea. "There's a reason every other species out here classifies Earth as a death world. It's not just the gravity or the predators. It's that we spent 10,000 years fighting each other, the smartest, most adaptive opponent a human military can face. That arms race made us something unique." "You sound almost proud of that," I said. He considered it. "I'm not proud of the wars," he said. "But I'm proud of what we learned to do with what we became. Caro, from this point, we use it for something worth being proud of." On the 9th day, a Velhari scout came in fast with new intelligence. The Kreth were massing. A larger formation than any of the probe attacks. Ven came to find me personally, which she had started doing when the information was important enough to bypass the formal relay chain. She spoke and Yara, who was always nearby now, translated. "She says the Kreth are preparing for a final push. They know the Velhari fleet is weakened. They are going to come in force within 72 hours. I did the math in my head. The Armada was 2 days out. "Tell her we hold," I said. "Tell her 2 more days. And tell her," I stopped, choosing my words carefully. "Tell her that when those ships arrive, the Kreth are going to see something they have never seen in all their centuries of consuming civilizations. Tell her that the Deathworlders are not coming to defend. We are coming to end this." Ven listened. Her amber eyes held mine for a long moment. Then she said one word. Yara translated it quietly, "Good." They came out of faster-than-light travel in a staggered wave, not all at once, but in rolling pulses that lit up the sensor screens like a sunrise made of metal and fire. I was in the monitoring bay when the first contacts appeared. I had been there for 6 hours, unable to sleep, watching the long-range sensors with the focused anxiety of someone waiting for the most important thing they had ever waited for. And then the screen changed and I stopped breathing. The first wave was 60 ships. Then 120. Then the number climbed past 300, past 500, kept climbing. The Velhari sensor operators were calling out numbers in their own language and I didn't need Yara to translate their tone. It was the tone of people who had been counting down to 0 and had suddenly found the count reversing. By the time the full Armada had translated in-system, the sensor count stood at 2,341 vessels. Human warships. Every class, every generation. The great old dreadnoughts that had been built in the early days of space militarization, retrofitted and upgraded until they were barely recognizable from their original designs. The newer fast attack carriers that could deploy fighter wings in under 90 seconds. The specialist vessels, the electronic warfare ships, the long-range artillery platforms, the damage control and rescue ships that humans brought to every fleet action because we had learned the hard way that in war you must plan for your people to be hurt and you must be ready to pull them back from the edge. Support ships. Hospital ships. Repair tenders. And at the center of the formation, moving with the slow, absolute certainty of something that had nothing to prove, was the UES Eternal, Earth's flagship. A vessel so large that smaller ships could dock inside it, commanded by Admiral Grace Park, who had been leading the human fleet for 19 years and had never once lost a battle she had time to plan. A hailing frequency opened. I heard Admiral Park's voice for the first time, low, clear, unhurried. "UES Resolute, this is Admiral Park aboard the Eternal. Captain Wells, I read your full report. Well done to your entire crew." A brief pause. "Put me through to the Velhari commander." I watched Captain Wells open the channel and step aside. Watched Yara position herself to translate. Watched Ven step forward to face the screen showing Admiral Park's face. The two women looked at each other across the light seconds. Admiral Park said, "Commander Ven. My name is Grace Park. I command the human armada. We received your signal and we are here. I want to say one thing before we discuss tactics." She paused. "You fought for 11 years with 63 ships against 1,000. That is not a defeat. That is an act of extraordinary courage. My people are honored to stand beside yours." Yara translated. I watched Ven's face. I had been around Ven for 11 days. I had seen her composed, controlled, and unyielding through probe attacks and bad intelligence and the daily weight of knowing her world was dying. I had never seen her expression break. It broke now. Just for a moment. Just long enough to be real. Then she composed herself, lifted her chin, and spoke. Yara translated. She says, "Then let us make sure there is something left to stand beside when this is done." Admiral Park smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. "Agreed," she said. "Now, show me everything you have on the Kreth." The planning session lasted 14 hours. I sat in on all of it, which meant I went without sleep for the second time in 3 days and consumed enough Velhari cinnamon tea to make my hands shake slightly, but I was not leaving that room. Not for anything. Admiral Park was something to watch in a planning session. She listened more than she spoke, which I hadn't expected. She would ask a question, precise, targeted, exactly the right question, and then sit back and absorb the answer completely before asking the next one. She never interrupted. She never dismissed. When Ray presented his analysis of the Kreth swarm's distributed command structure, she leaned forward and asked him to walk her through it 3 times, approaching it from different angles each time, until she had it fully in her mind. Then she started building. The plan she constructed was, in my honest opinion, one of the most sophisticated pieces of military architecture I have ever been close to. I'm not a tactician. But I was in that room and I have described it to actual tacticians since, and they all use the same word for it. Brutal. Not cruel. Brutally efficient. The kind of plan that looks simple on the surface and hides layers of contingency and misdirection underneath. The core of it was this: we would not fight the Kreth the way the Velhari had been fighting them. The Velhari fought in elegant, organized formations, disciplined lines and rotating shields, the product of thousands of years of refined military doctrine. It was the kind of fighting the Kreth understood how to process. They had learned, over 8 civilizations, exactly how organized intelligent species responded to their swarm tactics. We were going to do something different. The human fleet would divide into 9 independent strike groups, each with its own orders, its own objectives, each operating with full tactical autonomy. No centralized command during the battle itself. Once the engagement began, each group commander made their own decisions. The groups would hit the Kreth swarm from 9 different vectors simultaneously, each using different tactics, different timing, different weapon systems. Some groups would push hard and fast. Some would feint and pull back. One group had orders to do something so counterintuitive that even Ray looked slightly uncomfortable explaining it. They were to fly into the Kreth formation, deep into the body of the swarm, and start fighting from the inside out. The swarm's collective intelligence will fracture, Admiral Park explained quietly, her finger tracing patterns on the tactical map. It has never had to process 9 simultaneous threats coming from 9 different directions using 9 different tactical approaches. Every previous enemy it has faced has had a unified doctrine, one way of fighting that the swarm could read and predict and respond to. We will give it 9 doctrines at once. Its lag time in adapting will compound. And while it is confused, she tapped the center of the map, where the estimated position of the Kreth's distributed command nodes was marked. We take it apart from the inside. She looked around the room. At the human commanders, at Ven and her officers, at me and Captain Wells and Ray. The Velhari fleet will not be used as a main assault force, she said. With respect, Commander Ven, your ships have fought for 11 years and your crews have earned rest, not a suicidal charge. The Velhari fleet will form a defensive perimeter around the homeworld. If any Kreth ships break through our lines, your people stop them. But I do not intend to let anything break through. She said it not with arrogance. With certainty. There is a difference and it matters. Ven said something. Yara translated. She says she has a request. She wants 1 Velhari ship to fight alongside the human Armada in the assault. Not for tactical advantage. For... Yara paused, finding the right word. For witness. She wants someone of her people to see this with their own eyes. To carry the truth of it home. Admiral Park nodded immediately. Granted. Tell Commander Ven I would consider it an honor. I caught Ven's eye across the room. She gave me a small, precise nod. I nodded back. HFY, I thought, from this point I carry this with me. Whatever happens next, I was in this room when humanity decided to stand between the innocent and the end of everything. And I will not forget it. They arrived 19 hours after the Armada, as if they had sensed the change, the new mass of metal in their path, and had decided to come before whatever was gathering could finish gathering. The long-range sensors lit up like a fire alarm. 893 Kreth vessels, moving in the dense, grinding formation that Velhari records showed again and again. A blunt wall of ships moving forward, absorbing fire, closing distance, overwhelming by mass. They had never encountered anything that couldn't be overwhelmed by mass. I was on the bridge of the Resolute. We had been assigned as a support and communication vessel, positioned at the rear of the second human strike group. My job, specifically, was to maintain the translation link between Admiral Park's command and the Velhari defensive perimeter. It was not a glamorous role. It was, in that moment, the most important role I had ever held. The last message from Admiral Park before the engagement came through fleet-wide, to every human and Velhari ship in the system. She said, "Every species this enemy has ever met fought them alone. Today, for the first time, they meet something different. They meet us at our best, which is not alone, which has never been alone. Go." For a moment, just one moment, there was absolute silence across every comm channel. Then 2,341 human ships and one Velhari vessel moved forward, and the silence became something I do not have words for. I have tried many times since to describe what it looked and felt like from my station on the Resolute, watching the sensor feeds and comm traffic of the largest space battle in human history unfolding in real time. I always fail. The scale was simply too large for any single perspective to hold. I could see fragments. I could track the broad shape of it. But the totality of it was beyond description. What I can tell you is this. Strike Groups 1, 3, and 7 hit the Kreth Vanguard head-on with everything they had, dreadnoughts at the front, pouring fire into the Kreth formation at close range, forcing the swarm's attention and response toward the center. While the swarm was oriented forward, Strike Groups 2, 5, and 9 came in from the flanks at angles so acute they were almost parallel to the Kreth formation, not hitting it but grazing along it, picking off the edge ships that anchored the swarm's formation integrity. Strike Group 4 did the counterintuitive thing Ray and Admiral Park had planned. They went in. Straight into the body of the swarm, 50 ships moving fast, breaking apart into individual fighters the moment they hit the Kreth formation's interior, fighting from inside out, forcing the swarm to respond to a threat it had no instinct to process. Strike Groups 6 and 8 held back in reserve, not because Admiral Park was being cautious, but because she was waiting, watching the swarm's response, identifying where the distributed command nodes were pulling the most resources, where the swarm was thickest and most reactive, finding the nervous system. I watched the battle for 4 hours before the moment came. 4 hours in, the Kreth swarm began to change. It wasn't visible at first, not on the tactical display, not to anyone watching the broad picture. But Ray, who was beside me watching specific data feeds, grabbed my arm and pointed at a cluster of readings in the center left of the formation. "There," he said. "Look at the response lag. That cluster, those 12 ships, every time something happens in sectors 3 and 7, they're the slowest to redirect. They're carrying more load than any other node in the swarm." He looked at me. "That's the heart of it. That's where the command is concentrated." I opened the channel to Admiral Park's command vessel immediately. She responded in seconds. Ray walked her through the data. There was a brief pause, 5 seconds, maybe 6. Then, Strike Groups 6 and 8. Priority target. Sector center left, I'm sending coordinates now. Everything you have. Go. 240 human ships that had been holding back for 4 hours moved at once. What happened in the next 11 minutes is documented in the official battle records, and I will not try to improve on the precision of those records here. What I can tell you is what it looked like on the sensor feed, a concentrated, overwhelming convergence on 12 Kreth ships that had no idea they were the most important 12 ships in the engagement. Strike Groups 6 and 8 hit them with every weapon system available. Long-range artillery first, from outside their effective response distance, then the fast attack carriers closing in, then the dreadnoughts bringing their main batteries to bear. The 12 ships held for 4 minutes. Then they didn't. And when they died, something happened to the Kreth swarm that had never happened in 11 years of war. It hesitated. Not stopped. Not fled. Hesitated. A pause of maybe 8 seconds where the swarm's movements became uncoordinated, where ships that had been moving in perfect terrible sync suddenly had no consensus about direction. 8 seconds of confusion in a fleet this size is an eternity. Ray was already on the comm to every strike group commander. All groups, maximum pressure now. Don't let them recoordinate. Push. Every human ship in that engagement pushed. And the Kreth, for the first time in their history of consuming civilizations, began to break apart. It was not quick. It was not clean. They did not run exactly. The swarm intelligence seemed to lack a concept of retreat, which in the end worked against them. Ships that would have survived by withdrawing instead held position until they were destroyed. The engagement lasted another 6 hours after the command nodes fell, grinding and brutal, with human ships taking serious fire and damage throughout. We lost 112 vessels that day. 112 ships and the crews aboard them, names I will not list here because there are too many of them and they each deserve more than a list, and because this story is not the right place for it, and because I think about them every single day. But the Kreth fleet, when the last of them had been destroyed or scattered beyond recovery, was gone. 893 ships. Gone. I sat in my station on the Resolute after the last contact disappeared from the sensor board, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel after you've been holding your breath for hours and you finally let it out, exhausted and shaking and overwhelmingly, incomprehensibly relieved. Yara was sitting beside me. She reached over and took my hand and we sat there in silence for a long time. 3 days after the battle, I stood in a Velhari open-air gathering space, something between a plaza and a park built at the top of their command station, open to the sky of their world, and I watched a red sun set over a planet that was still alive. The sky here was a deep, rich burgundy at midday and shifted toward violet and then a strange pale gold at sunset. The trees, if you could call them trees, were tall and silver-barked with leaves that were almost translucent, catching the light in a way that made them look like they were made of stained glass. Everything about this world was different from Earth, and everything about it was beautiful, and 3 weeks ago it had been 72 hours from ceasing to exist. Ven found me there. She moved quietly, they all did, the Velhari, with a kind of natural stillness that I had come to associate with a species that had survived by being thoughtful rather than loud. She stood beside me and looked at the sunset, and for a while we didn't need Yara because we were just two people standing under a sky, and that translated fine on its own. Eventually she spoke. Yara, who was sitting a respectful distance away on a low bench, translated softly. She says, "There is a word in our language, Velareth. It means something like, the debt that cannot be repaid. The Velhari do not use it lightly. It is a sacred word. She says that humanity is now Velareth to her people. That this will be remembered in every record we keep, passed to every generation, for as long as the Velhari exist." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Tell her that humans don't keep debts like that. We didn't come because we expected to be remembered. We came because someone was in danger and we could help. That's all it was." Yara translated. Ven listened, and then she said something that made Yara pause before translating. She says, "That is exactly why the word applies." I didn't have an answer for that. So I just nodded and we watched the gold light fade together. In the days that followed, things moved quickly. Admiral Park and the Fleet Command began the formal process of establishing a mutual defense treaty between humanity and the Velhari, the first such treaty between human beings and an alien civilization. It would take months to finalize, years to fully implement. But the shape of it was clear. We would share technology, share intelligence, share the defense of each other's space. The Velhari had things to offer that we hadn't yet imagined. 3,000 years of scientific development, medicine that could do things our best doctors called impossible, an understanding of certain physics principles that our theoreticians had been working toward for decades without reaching. And we had things to offer them that they were only beginning to understand the value of. Ray had a meeting with Velhari military engineers that lasted 2 days straight. He came out of it looking like a man who had seen a vision. He told me later that the Velhari's reaction to human weapon systems had been a fascinating combination of admiration and discomfort. They found our approach to force simultaneously impressive and slightly disturbing, which he took as a reasonable response. "They're going to be okay," he said to me on his way to another meeting. "With us watching their backs, they're going to be okay." I believed him. But there was one more thing that hadn't happened yet. One more thing that I had been thinking about since the battle ended, since the silence had settled and the work of peace had begun. Something that couldn't wait, that I needed to do before I went home, before the Resolute turned back toward Earth and the stars here fell behind us. I went to find Captain Wells. I found her where I expected to find her, alone in the monitoring bay, the same place where all of this had started, sitting in front of the screens that were now mostly quiet. Most of the fleet traffic moved to dedicated military channels that she no longer needed to monitor. She had a cup of the Velhari cinnamon tea in her hand. She looked tired in the way that people look tired after they have done something enormous and the adrenaline has finally, completely left their body. She looked up when I came in and nodded at the chair beside her. I sat. "How are you doing, James?" she asked. "Honestly? I thought about it. I'm not sure yet. I think it's going to take a while to understand what just happened." She nodded slowly. "That's how it always is. The big things take time to become real." She looked at her tea. "When I was 22 and I first went to space, I spent my whole first tour convinced that nothing meaningful was going to happen. That space was just big and cold and empty. Nothing out here to find, nothing that mattered. She smiled faintly. Now here we are. You sent that message to command? I said. The one with the personal note. That's what started the Armada moving. You found the signal, she said. I almost ignored it. She looked at me steadily. But you didn't. We sat with that for a moment. What happens now? I asked. For us, I mean. The Resolute. We go home, she said simply. We debrief. We write the most significant report in the history of the Deep Space Monitoring Corps. And then, I imagine we go back out. Because there's more space to listen to, and more signals we might almost miss. She paused. And now we know what those signals can mean. I nodded. I looked at the screens, quiet now but alive with the steady background traffic of a system that was healing, rebuilding, beginning to breathe again. 4,600,000,000 lives. Still here. Still breathing. Still building their silver-leaved trees toward a burgundy sky. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The sleepless nights. The 11-day wait. The terror of watching 63 ships hold a line they couldn't hold forever. The planning session. The battle. The 112 ships we lost. Ven's face when the translation came through. Admiral Park's voice saying go. Ray's hand shaking slightly as he pointed at the sensor data and said there. I thought about my mother in Cincinnati. My sister's new baby who would grow up in a universe that had just become something different. Something where humanity had stood up and been counted in a moment that mattered. I wondered if that baby would ever know. Probably not the full story. Probably just a line in a history book someday. In 2247, humanity made first contact and responded to a distress call that changed the course of galactic civilization. Something like that. Something that made it sound clean and decided when the truth was that it almost didn't happen, that it required one person to not ignore a beep on a screen at 3 in the morning, that it required a captain to write a personal note to command that she had no authority to write, that it required 1,000 decisions by 1,000 people every step of the way. That's how the big things happen. Not in one dramatic moment. In 1,000 small decisions by people who could have looked away and didn't. Captain Wells stood and stretched and looked at me with warm, tired eyes. Get some rest, James. We leave at 0600. She left. I stayed. I stayed until the burgundy light outside the station faded to violet, and the stars came out. Strange stars, not my stars, not the ones I'd grown up under, and I let myself sit in the full weight of it. All of it. The fear and the exhaustion and the grief for the people we'd lost and the overwhelming, staggering, almost unbearable gladness that we'd made it. That they'd made it. That somewhere out there in the Velhari city below 4,600,000,000 people were sleeping. Actually sleeping tonight, not waiting for the end, because a signal had gone out into the dark and the Deathworlders had heard it. We had answered with an armada. I pressed my hand to the cold glass of the observation window one last time and thought of what I'd said, 11 days out, in the dark between the stars. We're coming. HFY, from this point on I carry this with me. I carry all of it. The signal, the planning, the battle, the loss, the victory, the sunset over a silver-leafed world that almost wasn't there to have a sunset. I carry Ven's face when she first heard we were real. I carry the moment 2,341 human ships moved forward and the silence became something I still don't have words for. I carry the 112. I carry all of it. And someday when there is another signal, because there will be another signal, there is always another signal in a universe this large and this full of life, I will be listening. We will be listening. Caro, that's who we are. That's who we've always been. And